The clock glowed like an accusation in the dark. 3:07 a.m. Margaret Ellis blinked against the neon red digits on her bedside table, her eyes dry from half sleep. She didn't sigh. She didn't stretch. She just stared. Again, for the 8th night in a row. She'd woken at precisely that moment, threats 7, not a second sooner, not a second later. Outside her bedroom window, the branches of the tall pines swayed in the cold autumn wind, tapping gently against the glass like impatient fingers. A distant owl called, and then all was still again. The rest of the Willow Ridge retirement community lay in perfect silence. But for Margaret, the silence had become its own kind of noise, an echo chamber for the question that buzzed louder with each passing night. Why now? She sat up slowly, her joints murmuring their protest, and reached for her robe. The room was dark but familiar lace curtains, framed photos of her late husband, a modest bookshelf filled with medical journals, gardening guides, and Agatha Christie paperbacks. On the wall hung a faded diploma, Margaret Ellis, registered sleep technician, a lifetime ago, as she tied her robe and slipped her feet into wool-lined slippers. The floor whispered beneath her steps. She moved through the kitchenette with practiced grace, flicking on the kettle, opening the cupboard for chamomile. The sound of water heating was a small comfort, a reminder that the world still moved forward, even when your nights fell apart. She reached for a small leather-bound notebook on the counter. It was worn and familiar, filled with her own handwriting in tidy rows. She called it her sleep journal, a habit from her clinical days that she'd never quite shaken. She flipped to the last entry. Night 5 woke at 3:07 a.m. No sound, no dreams, just awake, again. Tonight would be night 6. Margaret clicked her pen and started writing night 6, 3:07 a.m. again. Fully alert, pulse steady, no noise, no nightmares, no urgency to pee, just awake. She paused, then added, "This is not random. It wasn't." She knew better, as a former sleep tech. She'd seen her share of geriatric sleep disturbances, restless leg syndrome, REM behavior disorder, anxiety dreams, medication side effects, but this was too consistent, and she wasn't the only one. The next morning, the sunroom was bright with early light, pouring through wide windows that overlooked the garden path. Retirees sat in their usual places, sipping weak coffee and murmuring over jigsaw puzzles. The scent of oatmeal and cinnamon toast drifted in from the dining hall. Margaret sat beside Edith Hargrove, an 80-year-old former art teacher with silver curls and a habit of humming old jazz tunes when she was thinking. She wore a lemon yellow shawl and fingerless gloves that she claimed helped her with puzzle grip. Margaret sipped her coffee, then spoke casually. "You ever find yourself waking up around 3 a.m. lately?" Edith paused, mid-puzzle piece. "Funny you ask. Past few nights I've been popping up around 3:00-something. Thought maybe my bladder was playing games again?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. 3:00-something. Yeah, like 3:05. Maybe 3:12 once. Weirdly close. Frank Garrison, sitting across the room reading the sports page, looked up. "Same here," he said gruffly. "Last 3 nights. Always between 3:00 and 3:10. Been chalking it up to old age. But it's starting to bug me." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "You all wake up, but not because of dreams, not because of needing the restroom. Just..." Awake Ruth Chin, knitting quietly by the fireplace, nodded slowly. "I thought I heard birds at 3 a.m. Then I realized the window was shut. No birds. Just me, eyes open, fully alert." A small chill threaded its way down Margaret's spine, not from fear, but recognition. "This isn't normal," she said softly. "Not all of us. Not every night. Not the same time." There was a hush. The puzzle lay forgotten. Coffee cups hovered midair. Edith broke the silence. Well, now you've got me spooked. No, Margaret replied, sitting back, just curious, deeply curious. She looked around the room. Seniors in slippers, laughter muffled by fatigue, but underneath it all, a quiet rhythm had started to beat. Something was waking them not just from sleep, but from complacency. Margaret glanced toward the wall clock in the sunroom. 9:07 a.m., exactly 6 hours since she'd last opened her eyes. She opened her notebook and wrote one more line. Others are waking too. Something's happening. And just like that, the game had begun. By Thursday, Margaret Ellis had a folder in hand and fire in her spine. She walked the corridors of Willow Ridge Retirement Community with purpose. The manila folder tucked tight beneath her arm like a mission file. Inside were 5 pages her own sleep journal, printouts from Edith, Frank, and Ruth, and a typed summary she titled Night Waking Pattern Report, Initial Observations. A former nurse passed her in the hallway and smiled. Margaret gave a polite nod, but didn't slow her stride. She was headed to Dr. Leo Brandt's office, and she had no intention of leaving until he listened. The wellness director's office was perched on the 2nd floor, right across from the therapy suite. His space was aggressively modern bamboo flooring, succulents in curated ceramic pots, a framed quote on the wall that read, "Sleep is the best meditation, Dalai Lama." Margaret thought it was ironic, given the circumstances. Dr. Brandt looked up from his screen when she entered. Mid-40s, athletic build, expensive cologne, and a slightly patronizing smile that had worn thin over the past few months. "Good morning, Mrs. Ellis," he said cheerfully. Gesturing to the chair, "What can I do for you today?" Margaret sat, spine straight, chin up. "I believe we may have an undetected sleep-related issue spreading among residents." That got his attention, but only slightly. "Go on." She opened the folder and slid the contents across his desk with the same calm precision she once used to place EEG leads during overnight studies. "These are logs from multiple residents, myself included. All show wake-ups occurring between 3:05 and 3:12 a.m., 6 days straight. We're all waking up at nearly the same time." Dr. Brandt flipped through the first few pages with a furrowed brow, his lips pressed together as he skimmed Ruth's handwriting and Edith's time entries. This could be stress or age-related circadian fragmentation. Quite common. Actually, Margaret crossed her arms, but not synchronized. Not this precisely. These are healthy residents. No major medications. No sleep disorders, at least none formally diagnosed. And it's more than just bad dreams or a quick trip to the restroom. Brandt leaned back in his ergonomic chair, tenting his fingers. "Margaret, you know as well as I do, aging changes the sleep cycle. Seniors often wake up during the night. Their melatonin levels drop. Deep sleep gets shorter. This isn't necessarily abnormal." She exhaled quietly. "Dr. Brandt, I spent 35 years studying sleep. This isn't ordinary fragmentation. Something is interrupting our sleep cycles in the same time window. If it's environmental, we need to investigate. If it's medical, we should screen. And if it's psychological, well, then that's your department." His eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting this is some sort of outbreak? I'm suggesting it's a signal." He drummed his fingers on the desk. "With all due respect," he said, a condescending warmth in his tone. "Sometimes hyper-awareness creates patterns where there are none, and anxiety, especially in close communities, can be contagious." Margaret's jaw tightened. She'd heard this tone before. It was the sound of someone waving you off because you were old, or female, or too smart for your own good. She stood, gathering her papers. "Thank you for your time, Dr. Brandt. But I won't be dismissing this." as she walked out of his office. She could feel his eyes following her, not in concern, but in that same amused skepticism professionals sometimes give their retired counterparts. Margaret didn't care. She was more convinced than ever something was happening at Willow Ridge, and if no one else was going to take it seriously, then it was up to her. Later, that day, the sleep watch forms that afternoon. Margaret sat on the garden bench beside the koi pond. Autumn leaves swirled lazily over the surface of the water. Her breath steamed in the cool air as she scribbled in her journal. Before long, Edith joined her, so the older woman asked, sitting down and wrapping her shawl tighter. What did the good doctor say that we're overreacting, possibly imagining things? Classic gaslighting. Sounds like my first husband, Edith muttered, rolling her eyes. So now what? We log everything. Times, symptoms, environmental details, nocturnal sounds. I'm calling it the sleep watch. Soon. Ruth and Frank joined them. Then George from apartment 17, who'd overheard them in the sunroom and added his own account 3:09 a.m. Wide awake, with an odd pressure behind his eyes, Margaret passed out blank sleep logs. She gave them tips on tracking disturbances, keep a pen and paper by the bed, mark anything unusual, listen for sounds, pay attention to physical sensations. They were older, yes, but they weren't passive. Not anymore. As dusk settled over Willow Ridge, the small group of retirees, formerly quiet, reserved, and largely invisible, had quietly declared war on the unknown. Something was waking them all at 3 a.m., and now they were wide awake. The hallway outside Margaret's apartment was quiet but not silent. It was the kind of quiet that hummed beneath the surface, like a whisper behind a wall, something alive in the bones of the building, a soft vibration she hadn't noticed before. She stood in the hallway in her robe, her journal clutched in one hand, the other resting against the drywall. The clock back in her room had just flipped to 3:06 a.m. Then it happened again. Low, almost imperceptible. Not quite a noise, more like a sensation, a faint vibration that started in her fingertips and settled in her ribs. Margaret frowned and pressed her palm flat against the wall. Was it the HVAC? A transformer surge? Some electrical timer kicking in? She held her breath and listened. The sound faded, then returned a few seconds later. Not random, cyclical, mechanical. She walked to the stairwell door and opened it just a crack. A cool breeze brushed her face, carrying the sterile scent of freshly polished tile and the faint, metallic tang of old wiring. Somewhere below her, a system was stirring gears, fans, ducts. Margaret's mind lit up with clinical training. Environmental interference, a common, overlooked factor in sleep disruption. She'd written that herself in a continuing education seminar over 20 years ago. Back then, it referred to old radiators and hallway TVs. But now, could the very building itself be disturbing their sleep? Later, that morning, a visit to maintenance. At 10:30 sharp, Margaret knocked on the door to facilities maintenance. The air inside smelled like sawdust and WD-40. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with spare smoke detectors, coils of tubing, light bulbs, and an old microwave marked "Retired, do not use." Behind the desk sat Glenn Rivera, the head of maintenance, late 50s, beard like Santa Claus on vacation, and a baseball cap with Wrench Whisperer embroidered across the brim. "Margaret," he said, surprised. "Something break in your place?" "No." "Something's humming." He leaned back. Humming. She explained the wake-ups, the timing, the vibration in the walls. Glenn's smile faded gradually as she spoke. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a clipboard. "Well, HVAC goes into power clean cycle at 3 a.m. Every third day, clears the filters. Calibrates sensors. We run at low speed to keep it quiet. But it's still a thing. Didn't realize it reached residential halls. Margaret's brow lifted. Every third day, it's been 6 consecutive nights for me and others. He nodded. Each wing's on a staggered rotation. North wing, south wing, east wing, admin wing, back again. So, if you're sensitive, it could feel like every night. She scribbled a note in her journal. Could that sound cause partial arousals, not fully awake but enough to disturb sleep? Glenn shrugged. I'm not a doc, but I can tell you, most folks sleep through it. Or don't notice. Maybe it's different when you're older. Or if you're listening. That last part stuck with her. If you're listening. That evening, data collection begins. Back in her apartment, Margaret laid out a plan. She placed sticky notes on her map of Willow Ridge, color-coding residents by wing. Each sleep watch member now had a new assignment: track your wing, record the vibration, log time, intensity, and any other disturbances. George in the East Wing reported faint clinking noises like pipes adjusting. Ruth said her thermostat reset to 68 degrees exactly at 3:08 a.m., causing a sudden draft. Frank thought his bed frame vibrated slightly, but chalked it up to an old man's nerves. Still, a pattern was emerging. Environmental triggers, infrastructural rhythms, invisible disruptions that only the elderly sensitive, underobserved, underestimated could detect. By the end of the week, Margaret had built a spreadsheet with military precision. She tracked wake-up timestamps, wing-specific maintenance cycles, reported symptoms: chills, heart racing, auditory illusions, HVAC schedule, outside noise levels, and the conclusion: a near-perfect overlap between scheduled system cycles and resident wake-ups. She needed one more piece of proof. Midnight investigation. The proof. Margaret stayed up that night, thermos of decaf in one hand, small digital recorder in the other. She stood in the hallway near the utility closet on the north wing, where Glenn said the cycle started. 2:09 a.m. The lights dimmed for a moment, barely noticeable, unless you were watching. 3:30. A subtle click, then hum. Her recorder picked it up. She placed her hand on the wall again. The sound seemed to travel through the structure, like a wave of restless energy. She whispered into the recorder. The vibration begins exactly at 3:00 a.m. Residents in this wing report waking between 3:04 and 3:10. Suggests a 4 to 6 minute delay from mechanical start to perceptual impact. This could be it. And then footsteps behind her. She turned sharply, expecting Glenn or maybe security. Instead, it was Ruth, wrapped in her shawl, holding a flashlight. I figured you'd be out here, she said, breath fogging in the air. I felt it again. Same time. Margaret smiled faintly. Good, let's log it. They stood together for a moment, 2 women in their 70s, listening to the hum of a machine no one else noticed, finally feeling heard. The storm came in fast that night, unexpected, quiet at first, and then booming. By midnight, the skies above Willow Ridge trembled with thunder. Rain tapped against the windows like 1,000 tiny questions, with no answers. Margaret Ellis lay awake, the hum of her air purifier blending with a low rumble of distant thunder. Her eyes refused to close. She didn't bother looking at the clock. She knew what time it was, or rather, what time it would soon be. 3:07 a.m. She could feel it coming, the way a sailor knows the wind will shift before the sails do. Across the courtyard, in apartment 1B, Frank Garrison had also awakened. Unlike Margaret, Frank didn't rise from bed. His eyes fluttered open and then closed again, then open. Then he gasped. Pain stabbed down his left arm, dull and slow at first, then sharper. His heart thudded like a sledgehammer. He tried to sit up, but the room tilted wildly. "What the hell?" he whispered. Then he collapsed, hitting the nightstand on the way down. A flash of panic. The overhead lights flickered. Somewhere in the building, the HVAC systems were shifted, paused, then resumed with a low groan. Margaret, seated at her kitchen table with a mug of tea gone cold, noticed the shift and frowned. She made a note in her journal. Then came the knock. Bang, bang, bang. Someone was pounding on her door. She rushed to open it. George stood there, his hair wild, slippers soaked from running across the courtyard in the storm. His breathing was ragged. "It's Frank," he panted, collapsed. "I found him on the floor. He's not talking." Margaret didn't ask questions. She grabbed her emergency phone and hit the facility nurse line, barking instructions like the clinician she used to be. Apartment 1B, male, 80s, collapsed, unresponsive but breathing, possible stroke. Send medics now, within 5 minutes. Red and blue lights danced against the wet windows of Willow Ridge. The paramedics moved efficiently, lifting Frank onto the gurney, checking vitals, running protocols. Margaret stood nearby, her fists clenched, a storm raging outside and inside. She glanced at the wall clock in Frank's apartment as they wheeled him out. 3:08 a.m. The tension cracks later that morning. The sleep watch met in hushed tones in the sunroom. The smell of burnt toast clung to the air, but no one touched their breakfast. Margaret paced slowly. Frank woke up at the exact same time. Again. But this time, something went wrong. Heart attack, stroke. "We won't know until we hear from the hospital, but this can't be a coincidence." Ruth, visibly shaken, clutched her knitting with trembling fingers. "I can't help but feel like we've been ignoring something urgent." "We haven't ignored it," Margaret said firmly. "They have." She marched out of the sunroom and down the corridor to the administrative wing, fury rising in her chest like fire. Confrontation with Dr. Brandt. Doctor. Leo Brandt looked up as Margaret stormed in, rain still clinging to her coat, eyes burning behind her reading glasses. "You have a moment?" she asked, voice tight. He gestured to a chair, but she didn't sit. "Frank Garrison had a stroke last night," she said flatly, "at 3:08 a.m. Dr. Brandt blinked. "Is he alive? For now. But do you understand what this means?" He set down his tablet. "Margaret, no. I want you to hear me. This is not just about being tired. This is about early warning signs, about preventable incidents being brushed off because we're old. Now hold on. We've tracked vibrations, HVAC cycles, temperature changes, even emotional patterns. We have data. But you've treated us like nervous children with bedtime stories. One of us could have died." "Leo," he stood, "you can't make a clinical diagnosis based on anecdotal." "I'm not making a diagnosis," she snapped. "I'm demanding an investigation." Silence. Then something changed in Brandt's posture. The smug edge softened. His eyes fell to the file she now dropped on his desk, color-coded logs, notes, and timestamps. "I want this facility to bring in a sleep specialist," she said. "I want medical evaluations for the residents reporting symptoms, and I want the HVAC cycles reviewed immediately." Another pause. Then he gave a slow, reluctant nod. "I'll call the board." The fragile quiet that night. The storm had passed, the wind calmed, the skies cleared, but inside Willow Ridge, nothing was quite the same. The sleep watch huddled in George's room, reviewing updated logs, Margaret sat a little straighter. Her voice was calmer, but her eyes remained vigilant. Frank was in the hospital, stable, but his episode had shattered any illusion that this was just about sleep. Something deeper was happening. The body knows. The body warns. And sometimes that warning comes at exactly 3:07 a.m. Margaret looked out the window at the black sky, stars blinking overhead like distant signals. Tomorrow, she said softly, we find out what they're finally willing to admit. The conference room at Willow Ridge was rarely used for anything more intense than bingo announcements and flu shot sign-ups. But this morning, it buzzed with tension. The air was taut. Like the moments before a courtroom verdict, only the witnesses were gray-haired and cane-carrying, and the defendant was the system itself. Margaret Ellis sat at the head of the long oval table, her spine straight, eyes sharp behind her tortoiseshell glasses. Before her were stacks of paper logs, medical printouts, building maintenance schedules, her evidence. She called it. Lined up beside her were Edith, Ruth, George, and Carol, her quiet army. None of them spoke, but their presence made a statement of its own. At the opposite end of the table sat Dr. Leo Brandt, arms folded over a crisp button-down shirt, lips pressed into a line. Beside him, Marcia Reynolds, the facility's executive director, wore a neutral expression that leaned toward weary skepticism. Also present were two board members, a nurse supervisor, and Glenn Rivera from maintenance, who looked like he'd rather be fixing a pipe than sitting here. The silence broke with the gentle clearing of Margaret's throat. I'd like to begin, she said. Marcia gave a nod, and Margaret stood slowly, placing her palms gently on the edge of the table. She didn't need to raise her voice. The quiet gave her strength. The presentation. For the past 2 weeks, Margaret began, a number of us have experienced consistent, unexplained wake-ups around 3:00 a.m. I first assumed it was personal. Then I noticed a pattern. She passed out copies of the chart she'd created, a color-coded graph that showed wake-up times from 10 residents over 14 days. Red bars clustered eerily around the 3:05 to 3:10 a.m. window. Through observation and coordinated journaling, we've logged not only the timing of these disturbances, but also their environmental correlates: temperature drops, faint mechanical hums, changes in airflow, and even HVAC cycles. She clicked a small remote, and behind her, a projection screen displayed images, a chart of maintenance schedules, overlapping with reported wake-up times, a thermal scan of rooms before and after 3 a diagram of HVAC system pathways, more than anecdotal. She said, this is pattern interference, predictable, repeatable, and with measurable health effects. Dr. Brandt exhaled. Margaret, no one's dismissing the discomfort, but this isn't a controlled lab environment. We have limitations. People age, and aging means light sleep. There's nothing nefarious here. No, Margaret said calmly, but there is neglect. We're not just tired. We're exhausted, disoriented. Frank Garrison had a stroke the night he woke at 3:08 a.m. He'd been complaining of headaches for days. How many others are silently declining? And you're brushing it off as normal aging. Marcia cleared her throat. We all sympathize. But without clinical proof, you want proof. Margaret interrupted, placing Frank's hospital report on the table. Transient ischemic attack occurred at 3:08. Doctors believe it was stress-induced, potentially aggravated by abrupt waking from sleep. He's not the only one experiencing symptoms. Ruth has palpitations. Edith reports night sweats. George now uses oxygen after repeated 3 a.m. awakenings. Ruth's hands trembled. George coughed softly. You want clinical, Margaret continued, voice unwavering. Bring in a sleep specialist. Evaluate us properly. You don't have to believe me. You just have to believe we matter. A shift in the room. There was silence. Then Glenn, the maintenance manager, spoke his first words all meeting. She's right about the HVAC cycles, he said quietly. We rotate filter flushes and compressor tests across wings starting at 3 a.m. The vibrations are low frequency, but I've felt them. And I've got 40-year-old knees, not 70-year-old nerves. The board members looked at one another. One leaned forward. I'd like to motion we approve a third-party sleep health audit, she said. We owe our residents at least that. Brant opened his mouth to object but said nothing. Margaret sat back down, slowly. Her hand grazed her journal, where in the margin she had scribbled just hours earlier, "Let them hear us now," loud enough to reach their dreams. After the meeting, the sun poured through the hallway windows like a reward. The storm had passed. Margaret walked with Ruth toward the courtyard garden, the smell of lavender drifting up from the flower beds. I can't believe they actually listened, Ruth said softly. They had to, Margaret replied. We weren't whispering anymore. The two women sat on a bench beneath the dogwood tree. Birds flitted through the branches, and a breeze rolled over them gently. For a moment, the world felt light, but Margaret knew the work wasn't done. Not yet. The letter came 3 days after the board meeting, folded neatly and slipped under each resident's door. It bore the official Willow Ridge seal and a headline in bold Sleep Health Initiative launches. This week, Margaret read it twice before allowing herself the faintest smile. The facility would bring in a certified geriatric sleep specialist, conduct full evaluations of participating residents, and initiate an overnight audit of the building's environmental controls, starting immediately. HVAC cycles would be shifted to mid-afternoon. Thermostat calibrations were underway. Lights in common areas would dim automatically between 10 p.m. and sunrise to reduce overstimulation. It was, by every definition, a victory. And yet Margaret stood by her window that night at 2:58 a.m., still alert, still waiting, as if her body hadn't received the memo. The first changes. By the end of the week, the shift was noticeable. The halls were quieter at night, not just empty, but still. No hum, no flicker of distant utility cycling, just silence, deep and calm, a kind of silence that invited sleep instead of disturbing it. Edith, who hadn't slept through the night in years, reported her first dream in months. I think I was in Paris, she told Margaret with a misty smile over morning tea. Or maybe Milwaukee, hard to tell. There were croissants and saxophones. Ruth stopped clutching her chest each morning. George, who'd been on edge since the wake-ups began, finally made it through an entire crossword without snapping his pencil in frustration. Frank was still in the hospital, recovering slowly, but the incident had startled everyone, especially Dr. Brant, who now walked the halls with softer eyes and fewer dismissals. When the sleep specialist arrived, a cheerful, wiry man named Dr. Julian Cruz. He greeted Margaret with a handshake and a simple sentence. I've read your logs. Impressive work, Ms. Ellis. She nearly cried. Data meets humanity. Doctor. Cruz didn't wear a white coat. He wore corduroy and sneakers and carried a tablet filled with sleep architecture charts. Over the course of 5 days, he conducted in-room evaluations, overnight oximetry testing, and heart rate monitoring. What he found stunned the staff. Your residents, he told the board, are suffering from an array of undiagnosed conditions: obstructive sleep apnea, REM behavior disorder, nocturnal hypertension, anxiety-linked insomnia. These aren't just quirks of aging. These are treatable medical concerns. Margaret sat in the back of that meeting, expression neutral, but her fingers trembled slightly. She knew what came next. the quiet shame of we should have known, but she didn't want shame. She wanted change. Night and memory one night. With the HVAC silenced and her diffuser puffing lavender into the air, Margaret lay in bed and waited for 3:07 a.m. But the time came and went, and she slept through it. The next morning, she awoke to sunlight streaming through the curtains, birds singing near the garden path, and her teacup still full on the nightstand. She sat up, blinking, no racing heart, no dry mouth, no vague dread. Sleep had returned, and it brought a piece of herself back with it. But something else stirred that morning, to a memory she hadn't let herself touch in years. Buried grief later that day. Margaret sat with Dr. Cruz in the library, sunlight pooling between the bookshelves. "There's something I didn't log," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He looked up from his tablet. "You don't have to. I want to." She inhaled deeply. "My husband passed at 3:07 a.m. 5 years ago. Heart attack. We were in our bedroom. I woke up to the sound of his breath, stopping. Dr. Cruz said nothing, just listened. I thought maybe the wake-ups were physical," Margaret continued, "but maybe they weren't only that. Maybe part of it was memory, muscle memory, grief, my body. Remembering the moment I lost him." A long pause stretched between them. "That's not unusual," he said gently. "Grief imprints on the nervous system. It whispers when the world is quiet." Margaret looked out the window. "I think I was listening for him," she said. More than machines. That night, she placed her sleep journal back on the shelf, not because she no longer needed it, but because it had served its purpose. The fight had never only been about vibrations or temperature drops. It had been about being heard, about refusing to be dismissed, about reclaiming the right to rest and to dream. She wrote one last entry. Night 21, no wake up. Slept 8 hours. Dreamt of a garden we never planted. And he was there. The moonlight washed over Willow Ridge like spilled milk cool, pale and unhurried. The once restless halls now slept deeply, where there had been flickering lights, faint humming, and whispered footsteps at 3:07 a.m. There was now only stillness, not silence, but peace. The kind of stillness you don't notice until you realize how long it's been since you last felt safe. Margaret Ellis stood by her window in a cotton robe, the faint scent of eucalyptus rising from her diffuser. Her hands, no longer clutching a journal or pen, rested easily on the windowsill. Outside, the garden shimmered under the soft glow of solar lanterns. The koi pond, still as glass, reflected the stars. She glanced at the small clock on her bookshelf. 3:06 a.m. She held her breath. Nothing stirred. 3:07 a.m. Still nothing. She smiled not with pride, but with something softer, something like relief. A new morning. When Margaret entered the sunroom the next morning, something in the atmosphere had shifted. There was a lightness in the way the residents spoke to one another, a rhythm in the shuffle of their steps, as if sleep had untangled a knot inside them no one had realized was there. Edith sat near the window, painting again for the first time in years. "Turns out dreams are great for inspiration," she said, dipping her brush into a soft violet. "I painted my father's old lake house last night. I could even hear the loons." George was deep in the morning paper, coffee in hand. He looked up with a grin, slept like a kid on summer break. No ghosts, no hums, just snoring. My own. Probably even Ruth, who had been the most tightly wound of them all, now giggled as she attempted Tai Chi near the fireplace. "I don't know what I'm doing," she confessed, "but I'm finally rested enough to try." Margaret walked past them all, greeting each warmly, her fingers trailing across the spines of books on the shelf, feeling everything, but saying little. She didn't need to. Their rested faces said it all. Frank returns. At 11:15 a.m. sharp, the front doors of Willow Ridge opened, and in rolled Frank Garrison, thinner than before, pale but alert, wearing a navy cardigan and a smirk. The residents burst into applause. "Don't get sentimental on me," Frank grumbled, though his eyes shimmered. "You all look 5 years younger. Guess I picked the right time to almost kick the bucket." Margaret walked over and took his hand. "We missed you," she said simply. Frank squeezed her fingers. "I heard what you did. Raising hell and running spreadsheets. Who knew sleep could start a revolution?" She smiled. "Turns out dreams have power." The garden bench, that evening. Margaret sat on the bench beneath the old dogwood tree, the one where she and Ruth had shared their first moment of understanding. When everything was still uncertain and frightening, now, it was different. She watched the residents walk the path in pairs or trios, some holding hands, others simply enjoying the breeze. The community felt awake in the truest sense, not restless, but aware. They were sleeping better, yes, but more than that, they were seen. She turned to Dr. Julian Cruz, who had joined her after his final evaluation rounds. "Did we fix it?" she asked. He shrugged, thoughtful. "We treated the environment. We diagnosed some hidden conditions. That's part of it. But the biggest change," he nodded toward the group in the courtyard. "You gave them back their dignity, their right to speak up, to ask questions, to matter." Margaret blinked against the tears that rose unexpectedly. "I thought maybe I was just stubborn," she admitted. "But maybe I was still grieving. Maybe the wake-ups were telling me something I didn't want to hear." Dr. Cruz nodded. "Sometimes our bodies know what our minds aren't ready to accept." One last wake-up that night. Margaret slept soundly, but just before dawn, she stirred not sharply, not in alarm. It was gentle, like someone whispering her name from far away. She opened her eyes. 3:07 a.m. She sat up slowly and looked out the window. The stars were still out. The wind shifted the curtains ever so slightly, and in the center of the garden, under the dogwood tree, she could swear she saw a man standing with his hands in his pockets, head tilted up to the sky. He looked familiar. She blinked. The space was empty. She smiled and lay back down. Not everything that wakes you is trying to hurt you. Some things wake you, to remind you that you're still alive.